Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So there I was eating my lunch and I flipped through the channels and I come across a documentary about Attila the Hun. And you know, Attila the Hun is not a character from history who I've ever really looked into in any great depth. However, I'm aware of the fact that the Huns, along with certain other tribes, the Alans and the Ostrogoths and so on and so forth, swept into Western Europe, Eastern and Western Europe in the 5th century. And there's some theories that this push from particularly the Huns, the other tribes as well, but particularly the Huns, was partly responsible for the ensuing kind of migration era that we saw in Western Europe. So the movement of Germanic peoples, such as the Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, the Franks, and so on. But the one thing which really made me raise an eyebrow, and the reason that I'm making this video, is because this guy from Game of Thrones, okay, he plays the Hound in Game of Thrones, and this guy don't really look like what I thought Huns would look like. Now, I hadn't really thought very much about what I thought Huns would look like, but my understanding was that they were from Central Asia. Now, we've got to recognise that people, humans, have intermingled and migrated right the way through human history, okay? So ultimately, the people that we are descended from came into Europe anyway and came into Asia, and they themselves intermingled. But my understanding is that a 5th century Hun probably wouldn't look like these guys, okay? I know that he's Scottish and this guy sounds English, and they kind of look that. They look pretty British to me. Let's say ethnically British, obviously not British by passport, because obviously that could be anything these days. But in terms of what they look like, they don't look like what I would have expected Huns to look like. So I got onto the internet and I started reading where were the Huns from and what ethnicity were they, what might they have looked like. Now, we've got to say at the very first point there that ethnicity is actually, in some sense, quite a modern, or at least our modern sense of ethnicity is quite a modern thing, because of course my ancestors, as far as I'm aware, came from various bits of Europe, possibly outside Europe as well, and they intermingled, and you know, most of the other people living in the British Isles are the result of this intermingling, and they would have been the same. The Huns were a people who were moving into Europe from the east in the 5th century. But what did they probably look like, roughly? Well, I don't think they looked like these guys, okay? So what's very interesting is there seems to be a huge amount of academic debate about who exactly the Huns were, and it's confused by the fact that they allied and warred with certain other groups of migrating people, for example the Alans and the Ostrogoths, who probably were quite different looking to the Huns themselves, or maybe they weren't, we don't really know. But the general gist of the two sides of the academic debate seems to be, and there are others, but the two main sort of weighty arguments are that on one side that the Huns were possibly a kind of proto-Turkic people, and on the other hand that they were possibly more like Mongolian people. But there are other theories as well. There are some theories that perhaps they were a little bit more what would conventionally be known as Caucasian, or indeed that they were more like Iranian in sort of origin and look. And we just basically don't know. And in China, it's pretty much a given thing that in the Chinese kind of academic circles, they believe that the Huns descend from a group of people who were on the borders of China at that time, and they moved westwards. So presumably they would have looked kind of Chinese or maybe kind of Mongolian looking. But I find it fascinating that we've got this huge, incredibly influential group of people. And Attila the Hun, as some people have pointed out online and in various history books, that Attila was in certain areas regarded as a great national hero. So much so that his name was used in a similar way to Alexander the Great. So after Alexander the Great conquered a huge area, many areas of the world, famously Afghanistan, carried on his name and his legend, and also harked back to the fact that they had people who related genetically back to that great hero. And it was the same thing with Attila the Hun in some areas. And it's quite likely that a lot of the areas where Attila actually conquered do in fact have Hun or Hunnic, I don't know, Hunnish sort of genetic roots. But in other areas, they were probably just a ruling elite, and actually the people of that area are probably genetically very similar to whatever they were before the Huns turned up. Anyway, I think it's all a fascinating topic. I think what I would say is that this is kind of, I hate to bring politics into it, but I think this is a bit whitewashing, I'm afraid. This is putting modern, sort of Western European looking people in roles that they almost certainly, Attila didn't look like the Hound from Game of Thrones. Almost certainly. I mean, we look at modern Turkish people or modern Iranian people, or we look at modern Mongolian people or various other bits of sort of Asia and the Middle East. They don't look like this guy. Okay. Is that what the Huns look like? We don't know. Clearly, Mongolian people don't look terribly similar to most modern Turkish people, but modern Turkey obviously was a large area. Certainly the Ottoman Empire brought in a lot of different peoples, and Turkish people themselves are a result of intermingling of different peoples. And so are the people of Asia as well. Okay, so people in Mongolia tend to look quite different to people in China, but clearly they have intermingled a lot at various points in history. So, to conclude, I think what I'll say is my only objection. I don't really have any objection, so to speak, but my objection is that these guys. I looked at them and I thought, that's supposed to be Attila the Hun? And that didn't make sense to me because they don't look anything like how I had imagined Huns. But it has to be said, that's partly to do with my ignorance based on the fact I hadn't looked into this before, and partly due to the fact that we actually don't freaking know what Huns look like. But it's fascinating. But it's a good reminder to everyone that peoples have migrated around a huge amount through history. We are all the product of migration and intermingling to lesser or greater extents, clearly in some areas more than in others. But anyway, to throw it back to you guys, what is your view? What do you think, based on whatever evidence you have at your fingertips, and maybe do a bit of Googling yourselves, what do you think the Huns probably look like? If you were going to cast people, modern people, to play 5th century Huns, would we be looking at Mongolian actors? Would we be looking at Turkish, maybe Middle Eastern actors? I don't know. It's fascinating, and the period descriptive accounts don't really shed an awful lot of light on what the Huns actually looked like, because obviously the Huns, the written accounts that we have access to, suggest that obviously they hated the Huns were the enemy, and so they're quite derogatory terms. They describe them as being small. They talk about scarring on the faces caused by swords or maybe hot irons, this kind of stuff that was done in childhood. So there were distinctive things said about what the Huns looked like, but it doesn't give us any clue really as to whether they looked maybe like Mongolian people or whether they looked like Turkish people or what. Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting. Anyway, if we wanted to do an artistic recreation, which is what a TV program is at the end of the day, what do we make a Hun, what do we make Attila the Hun look like? I don't know. Later centuries, we know, because if we look at the Mongols, for example, we know what the Mongols look like. The Mongols look like Mongolian people, but the Huns, more complicated. As soon as we get into the ancient world, geographical sort of lines between groups of people become far more blurred, because since that period there has been the migration era and a huge amount of mixing. We don't know. Anyway, so what do you think the Huns were? Where do you think they were from? What do you think they look like? Answers below this video, and I'll see you for the next video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We've got extra videos on Patreon, t-shirts on Spreadshirt, and I hope to see you for the next video.